In this video, I am going to show you how to take your ballerina pump pattern and turn it into a beautiful ballerina pump upper ready to be formed into a shoe. Now in a moment, I'm going to show you how we actually piece the pattern together, but I just wanted to really quickly go over the 3 allowances that you will find on this pattern. The first and most important allowance is going to be our seam allowance at the back. That is to help us close up the seam at the back, making this into a 3D shape. You'll also find a 5mm trimming / folding allowance around the top line of the shoe. Now in this case, I've used it as a folding allowance on the blue piece, which is the upper, and I've used it as a trimming allowance on the lining. The trimming allowance mostly gets cut off around the front section after you've stitched the top line of your upper, but I always like to leave a little extra at the back, which we're going to cut off at one of the last stages once we've finished the shoes. And last but not least, we've got our lasting allowance, which goes all the way around the bottom of the pattern, or what we call the feather edge. And that excess is so that we can wrap it under the last like that, and then place our sole on top. Piecing together our ballet pump pattern is so easy, and I thought I would go through how to do it with you now. First thing we're going to want to do is put together our pattern. So because this is a download and print at home pattern, we've broken it up to fit on printer paper nice and easily. So what we've got here is these little sort of hearts, and that's how you know you're matching it up properly. So if you look at these little sort of half hearts, they want to join together to make a full heart. So all you'll need is a little bit of sellotape, and if anything looks a bit weird, then you've probably done it not quite right. So once you've pieced them together correctly, they should make a nice little heart like that. Okay, so your pattern should look something like this once you've put it together. There's only one pattern here for both our upper and our lining, which makes this a really, really easy one to put together. You might be wondering though, why do we only have one pattern when we're making 2 shoes? And the answer is really simple. We are going to flip the pattern to give us left and right feet so that we're making an exact mirror image of the same pattern. There's a couple of other things to note on this pattern before we move on. The first and most important thing to note is our little notches. You'll see 2 notches on this pattern, one which indicates the exact center line of the pattern, and the other one indicates which is the inside. So rather than working on left and right feet, we work on inside and outside. Now the inside notch is really important because it helps us remember if we have in fact flipped our patterns or not. If we do forget to flip our patterns, we will be making 2 left feet. So it's really helpful to have that little notch so that you can realize whether you've got 2 opposites or not. Okay, so with the pattern explained, let's dive straight in and start cutting out our pieces. Now I'm going to do this pair of ballerina pumps in this really beautiful lambskin leather. It's not too thick at all. It's approximately 0.06 mil, so it's not too thick. It's really nice and soft, which I just love. And it's got a beautiful color as well. So let's open this up and start tracing out our pieces. Okay, there's one done. Now this is that really important bit we can't forget. We must now flip the pattern to get the other foot. Okay, at that point we can go ahead and cut these out. Now for the lining, I'm using the exact same leather, same thickness and everything. I'm just doing it in a different color. And remembering to flip that pattern. So we should have an upper and a lining in a left and an upper and a lining in a right. And the next thing we're going to do is stitch them all together. So the first thing I want to do here is take these shapes from 2D pieces into 3D pieces. And the way that I'm going to do that is stitch together the back seams. So I'm going to take a little bit of my non-toxic shoemaking glue here, and I'm just going to place a tiny, tiny bit on the very, very edge of that seam. Now this is just to hold it in place while you stitch, so it doesn't have to be the most secure hold ever. In fact, less is more here with the glue. And then we can go ahead and do that on all of the pieces, making sure that we're putting the glue on the right side of the leather, because we're actually going to be stitching inside out. So we want to very gently stick the right sides together. And that's another reason why we want to be really careful we don't use too much glue. Okay, now this glue dries best or sticks best when it's had a little bit of dry time. So once you've glued all the pieces, you can then go back to the first one that you glued and just flip it over and stick the two sides together. Now, if you were using fabric, at this point you would just use pins to hold it in place. But of course with leather, we don't want to have any pinholes in the piece. So that's why we're using a little touch of glue just to hold it in place while we stitch. Okay, at this point we're ready to get all those pieces into the sewing machine. One last thing I like to do is to just draw on about a 5mm line onto all those pieces, just so that I've got a line in which to follow when I'm stitching. Now, if you find yourself drawing on the right side of the leather, you've done something wrong here, because these should definitely be inside out at this stage. And if you're not sure how much 5mm is, you can always go back to your pattern to use it as a guide. So we're going to place that in and follow our line, and you can do a back stitch at the start and at the end. I've got mine on a 3mm stitch length, but you can use whatever stitch length you're comfortable with. I just wouldn't recommend using one too big, because we do want this to be a nice tight back seam. Once you've stitched all of the back seams, we're then going to open up those seams so that they're nice and flat on the outside like this. And that is so easy. We're going to go back to our non-toxic glue, and we're going to put a strip of glue right over the top of that stitch line, and the same thing on the other side as well. The reason we're putting the glue right over the top of the stitch line is because this is actually a contact adhesive, and what that means is that it needs to stick to itself. So when I actually go ahead and open this up and fold it back on itself, it's got glue on both sides. So you'll need to separate the two pieces that you originally glued together to hold it in place while we stitched. So it's a little reminder there of why we don't use too much glue to hold those pieces together in the first place, just to make opening it back up nice and easy. So then if we fold it back on itself, it sticks nice and flat onto the glue that we put right over the top of that stitch line. Something like that. Okay, now this next step is totally optional. Because I'm working with leather, I could just leave a completely raw edge on the top line, because of course it won't fray. But if you are working with any type of fabric that does have a fray to it, you might want to consider doing what I'm about to do here, which is folding the top line. Now, the other reason why you would fold a top line if you're working with leather is just because it gives a really nice, polished, finished look. So I know that with my pattern, I've got a 5mm folding allowance around the top line. So I'm going to really lightly draw on a rough 5mm line onto my piece so that I've got something to follow while I'm folding. Okay, so I've drawn on my rough 5mm folding allowance. That's also going to really help me as a guide when I'm doing my glue. But before I move on, I just want to take a little bit of the weight out of the back seam there, because when I fold this over, it's going to end up really, really bulky in that back bit. So I'm just using a safety beveler. You could even use a little craft knife or box cutter, or you can completely skip this step if you're just a total beginner. Okay, so once you've taken a little bit of the weight out of the back, we can start gluing. So we're going to do exactly what we did with our back seams. We're taking the spatula and going straight over the top of that line. So we've got glue on both sides of the line. Okay, so once we've got the glue all the way around the top line, we're just going to simply fold it over right on the line that we've drawn on. Now, if at any point you find that this isn't sticking down, it's usually because of one of a few reasons. The first is that you haven't given yourself enough dry time with the glue, or that you've used far too much glue, or that you haven't used enough glue, and it really needs to be on both surfaces that we're sticking together. So if you'd only put it on one side of the line and not the other side of the line, when you go to fold it, it would have nothing to stick to. Now, it can be a little bit tricky when we're going around these corners. So what I like to do is take some scissors and just put teeny tiny snips in around those edges. Now I'm doing the snips halfway to the line at best, sort of something like that. You definitely don't want these snips to go all the way to the line because we don't want to actually ever see them. And as we open it up around that curve, they just spread open a little bit, giving us a nice, neat curve. Okay, that's looking awesome. So I'm really happy with how that's looking. Before I go ahead and attach my lining, I'm going to fold the top line on the other upper. Okay, so once you've folded your top lines, which as a quick reminder is totally optional, if you don't want to have that folded edge, you can simply cut that extra 5mm off your pattern pieces. We are going to attach our linings. When doing the linings, it's really important that we are putting wrong side to wrong side, and we want to check that our notches are on the same side. And then if I put the two together so that the wrong sides are touching, we've now got the nice side on the outside of the shoe and the nice side on the inside of the shoe, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So once you've paired up your upper and your lining to the correct shoe, we can go ahead and start sticking these together. So to do this, we're actually going to turn both pieces inside out, and I'm going to put just a really small amount of glue right on the very edge of the top line of the upper, or pretty much where I folded. So if you haven't got a folded edge, just put it right up at the top. And this glue is also just to hold it in place while we stitch. So it also doesn't need to have an extremely strong hold, but just more so that things don't shift around while we're stitching it in place. Now with the lining, we should have about 5mm excess the whole way around the top line, and that's what's called our trimming allowance. So we want to take our glue and just place it about 5mm down from the top line. Now again, this can be really rough, so don't overthink it. But what I will say is don't do a full spatula width. We just want a really thin strip of glue there around the top. Okay, now at that point, I can turn this piece right way up again and place it over the top of the lining. So just as a reminder, we should be doing wrong side to wrong side. And I like to match the back seams first so that I know that they're in exactly the right place. And then you can just work your way around the top line, sticking the two top lines together. Now that 5mm excess around the top does not have to be perfect because it is trimming allowance. We're going to cut it off later on anyway. So if it's not exactly 5mm the whole way around, don't worry about that at all. As long as you've got a little bit of overlap of the lining, then you'll be good to go. Okay, so there is the first one looking great. And we've got the right side of the leather on the outside, the right side of the leather on the inside, and that is now ready for us to stitch our top line. I'm going to go ahead and do the same on the other one, and then we'll jump back on the sewing machine. So you can see I've started and stopped right at the back seam there, and I've gone all the way around the front as close to the edge as I possibly can. So let's dive straight in and do the other one. Okay, and that's stitched really beautifully as well. At that point, you can cut away any loose threads. And we've only got one last thing to do now, and that is to trim off the trimming allowance. Now, we actually want to keep a little bit of it on for the time being, and that's because we're going to use that at a later stage to attach the uppers to the lasts. But at this point, we can actually remove all of the excess from the front, just leaving a little bit of excess on the back. Now, the other thing you might notice at this stage is if your pieces don't match up exactly around the feather edge, that is totally fine. Most of this excess is going to get wrapped underneath the shoe and trimmed off anyway. So as long as you've got a nice, neat top line, then you've got nothing else to worry about. Okay, these are looking so good now. You'll see I did leave a little bit of trimming allowance on the back there. Don't overthink how much. If it's a little longer than that or a little shorter than that, it's really not going to make a big difference. But the most important thing is that you've trimmed it off around the curve of the front, because that can be quite difficult to do at the next stage. And we can now take a last, place that over the top, and then we can start to get a really nice idea of how that's going to look as a shoe. I hope you found that video helpful, and I can't wait to see how your shoes turn out.